Climate change catastrophe. These three words represent what may be at stake in relation to life on our planet. So my question is, are we doing everything we can to address this challenge? I will start by describing the words climate change catastrophe as made up of two parts. The first part is climate change. So, are we doing everything we can to prevent climate change and its adverse impact? I can't really answer that as I don't have any special expertise in climate change. The second part is catastrophe. Now, that is something I do know a lot about, how it arises and how it can be addressed before it happens. That is the focus of my advisory practice. So, are we doing everything we can in relation to this catastrophe? I will answer that up front. No, we are not, and we could be doing much more. Before I tell you why I say so, let me provide the context to explain how catastrophes materialize. I'm going to list a few events and ask you to think of what is common among these events. About 210 years ago, a powerful army marched up to Russia with no doubt to depose the Tsar. It ended in a fiasco. About 130 years later, another army had similar goals and also a disastrous ending. Enough about wars. About 20 years later, policymakers were certain that China's mandate for farmers to plow deeper and plant seeds closer would increase food production. It resulted in 45 million Chinese citizens starving to death over the next 5 years. About 50 years later, in 2010, there was a consensus in Germany to replace fossil fuels with clean energy sources. In 2022, following the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, this policy created an energy crisis and the potential for a national security catastrophe. In 2021, the US Federal Reserve had no doubts about their decision to stay with the easy money policy. It created the highest price level inflation in 40 years. It feels strange to compare the policy decision of an event where millions died with another that caused an energy crisis or an economic problem. And that is not my objective. But there are certain commonalities among these events in relation to policy decision-making. We will get to that in a few minutes. Let's first look at how catastrophes arise. We make all decisions, including policy decisions, based on what we know. And we address potential adversities by envisioning them and then trying to prevent them. But experience shows that adversities can arise from what we don't know or what is unknown to decision makers. This means two things. One, what we don't know can give rise to adversities. And two, such adversities arising from the unknown can't be prevented as we don't know what we need to prevent. Also, decision-making by definition is about future outcomes, and we can't possibly know everything about the future. Therefore, every decision has some unknowns which can give rise to adversities that can't be prevented. So, if we don't allow for the possibility of such unknowns, even though we don't know how these unknowns can turn into adversities, then we may not have the flexibility to change courses easily if we need to. Without such flexibility, we can find ourselves unprepared when an adversity arises from the unknown. This unpreparedness arising from not allowing for the unknown can turn an adversity into a catastrophe. This is how catastrophes arise. So, what was common among all the events I mentioned? Of course, they turn into catastrophes. But in the context of what I just described, in each event, decision makers were so certain about the outcome that they didn't allow for unknown factors, which are often called flaws when we look back at decisions. Such flaws turned their policy decisions into catastrophes. not allowing for the unknown that could not be envisioned in real time when decisions were made, and thus not providing flexibility to change courses meant that Napoleon's army was unprepared for the diseases, starvation, wintry weather, and defeat that had not been envisioned, and lost most of its 600,000 soldiers in about 4 months. China's rigid system didn't allow for any deviation from the policy, despite an unenvisionable decline in crop yield that resulted from the mandate. Germany had no easy and quick energy source to make up the shortfall from the previously unenvisioned disruption of oil and gas imports from Russia. And the Fed, envisioning and insisting that prices were increasing solely due to transitory factors, was behind the 8 ball as inflation was soaring. The point in this context is not that they should have done a better job of looking for flaws, but that no matter how much we try, there are always some unknowns that can give rise to adversities with potential to turn into catastrophes. So whether it is about war planning, national security, energy, food, clean water, healthcare, environment, economic policies, or any other area, we must allow for the possibility of unknown flaws in the premise, or we are vulnerable to catastrophes. I know this logic can get pretty dense, but I want you to keep in mind just one thing. We must be disciplined and allow for the possibility of the unknown in any policy decision. So what does it mean for climate change catastrophe? Before I talk about it, I want to say clearly that I'm not denying anything about climate change. I repeat, I'm not denying climate change. I'm simply suggesting that because the stakes are so high, we must look at our policy decision-making in the context of the challenge that not allowing for the unknown can turn an adversity into a catastrophe. So, speaking of the unknown, everything about climate change has some unknowns because nothing like this has happened in modern times. This means that we need to be mindful that we don't know everything about climate change, and what we do know of how and why climate is changing and how it can be prevented are hypotheses, albeit with a high degree of confidence, but they're still hypotheses. There is no way to test and prove them with 100% certainty. After all, we can't create a second Earth to simulate, test, and observe its climate. So there is no way to eliminate the unknown completely, regardless of how low is the likelihood that such an unknown can turn into an adversity. So it is within the realm of possibility that the real cause of climate change may be an unknown something else. I repeat, it is a possibility, and I'm not implying that it is likely that the cause may be something else, just a possibility. What this means is that there are two possible paths to catastrophe if climate change materializes. If we do nothing, the impact of climate change could be catastrophic. This is widely known to anyone concerned about climate change. However, if we do something, but do not allow for the possibility of the unknown or a flaw in current hypotheses, then the impact of climate change could also be catastrophic if a flaw becomes known later. What this implies is that not allowing for the unknown could be as catastrophic as the catastrophe we are trying to prevent. Because the fundamentals of life on Earth are at stake, not addressing the possibility of an unknown or a flaw and taking no action to address this possibility would be as reckless as not doing anything to prevent or mitigate the impact of climate change. We must address both paths because, in plain language, with so much at stake, we can't put all our eggs in one basket. Therefore, while we are taking actions to prevent the impact of climate change, it is incumbent upon us to also recognize the possibility and ask, what if the cause of climate change is something else? What if the current preventive actions do not reduce greenhouse gases? What if, despite a reduction in greenhouse gases, global temperatures keep rising? The path that raises these questions implies and requires us to assume that there is no absolute certainty that any actions to prevent climate change will succeed, and we may have to live with the consequences of higher global temperatures. So, if we allow for the unknown, and which assumes that we can't prevent temperatures from rising, then how do we minimize the adverse impact of living with it? This would call for adaptation. Addressing the unknown is not about choosing one path over the other. It is not about choosing prevention over adaptation or adaptation over prevention. It is about addressing both paths. Prevention is about minimizing the high likelihood of a catastrophe, whereas adaptation is about surviving if prevention is not successful. So we need to follow both paths simultaneously to ensure that the possibility of an unknown flaw is addressed. Therefore, to address the possibility of an unknown or a flaw, adaptation must be an important and significant part of the plan and must be pursued as proactively as efforts to prevent the adverse impact of climate change. The combination of efforts to prevent and to adapt will ensure that there are no holes in the decision-making process, and we can minimize the impact of an adversity turning into a catastrophe. Some people may say that we should turn to an alternative approach if and when the current approach is proven flawed. Actually, we should not wait, for the same reason as an individual should not wait to buy life insurance until all efforts to save one's life have been unsuccessful. Adaptation is our insurance policy, and we should not wait to start on it until all preventive efforts have been unsuccessful. We need to have it in place while we are doing all we can to prevent a catastrophe. The International Panel on Climate Change recognized adaptation in its 6th assessment report, which also sort of stated that it is being pursued as a less than half-hearted effort at best. It is clear that in comparison to prevention, we are not doing enough, nor with as much urgency to proactively push for adaptation. Think about it for a moment. We hear and read so much about what we need to do and do it urgently to prevent the adverse impact of climate change. How much do we hear about what and how urgently we need to do for adaptation? My guess is that you will agree, not much. This is why I believe we're not doing everything we can to address climate change catastrophe, and more can be and should be done. We need to act with urgency also because adaptation is not something that can be done quickly. It may take us decades to get there. Some things about adaptation may be obvious and simple to internalize, such as if sea levels would rise, then we should move human developments above and away from sea levels. Then there are other things that require years of work to internalize the problem and develop solutions, such as what do warmer temperatures mean for food production, air quality, clean water access, extreme weather events, infrastructure, new forms of molds, viruses, infections, and bacteria, and our vulnerabilities to them, or the need for new medical treatments, etc. We need to understand, define, and internalize what adaptation would mean in the context of climate change and what kind of policies are needed. So, to fully address climate change catastrophe, we need to ask, how do we pursue adaptation in a disciplined manner as seriously and as urgently as we are trying to prevent climate change catastrophe? What should be our goals and timeline for adaptation? What should be our priorities for adaptation? This is a challenge we must address and address soon. Considering what is at stake for our world, not doing so is as reckless as not trying to prevent climate change catastrophe. Thank you.